We need to talk.
You know my wife is Barren! Barren! Barren!
There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room right before someone's whole life changes, and Grace Reyes knew that silence the second her husband stood up from his chair. She had felt his hand leave hers under the table just seconds earlier, and something in her stomach already understood what was coming before a single word left his mouth. He looked at her the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away, and then, in front of 31 members of his own family, he said the one word he knew would break her in half. Barren. Not a whisper, not a private confession, a public verdict delivered like a headline in a room full of people who would carry that word home with them for years. What none of them knew, what he never once imagined, was that Grace was holding something in her purse that night that would end his version of the truth forever. And by the time this story is over, you will understand exactly why the silence that followed his voice
Barren!
Was louder than anything he could have shouted. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened in that living room, you have to go back 10 years, to a backyard cookout in Sacramento, California, where a 24-year-old nursing student named Grace Alvarez met a charming, ambitious young man named Michael Reyes. It was the kind of afternoon that only exists in memory afterward, string lights strung between two fences, someone's radio playing too loud, the smell of charcoal drifting across a small yard full of people who all seemed to know each other except for her. Michael introduced himself by refilling her drink before she'd even realized it was empty, and he had a way of making promises sound like plans already in motion. On their third date, sitting in a diner booth at 11 at night, he told her he wanted a real family, not just a marriage, and she believed him completely because she wanted exactly the same thing. She would tell her brother years later that it was the specific way he said it, like he had already pictured the whole life and simply needed her to walk into it with him. In the months between that cookout and their first real conversation about marriage, Grace watched Michael in 100 small situations that told her, or so she believed at the time, exactly who he was. He was the kind of man who remembered a coworker's kid's birthday, who tipped generously even when money was tight, who called his mother every Sunday without fail. Grace's coworkers at the hospital used to tease her about how quickly she'd fallen, and she'd always answer the same way, that some people just make a decision easy, that Michael had never once made her doubt where she stood with him. Looking back, she would later tell her brother that was exactly the problem. A man who never lets you doubt him is also a man who has learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how to keep you from asking the questions that matter most. 2 years later, they married in a small courthouse ceremony, followed by a backyard reception that Grace paid for mostly with overtime shifts at the hospital where she worked nights while finishing her nursing certification. It wasn't the wedding either of them had dreamed about as children, but it was theirs, built from scratch on tired paychecks and borrowed folding chairs, with Grace's coworkers bringing potluck dishes and Michael's college friends setting up a second-hand speaker system in the backyard. Michael's mother, a woman named Deborah, stood off to the side that day, polite, composed, and quietly watching everything, the way mothers sometimes do when they have already decided what role they expect a new daughter-in-law to play. Grace's own parents had passed years earlier, so it was her older brother Tobias who walked her down the short aisle, squeezing her hand once before letting go, telling her under his breath that he was proud of her and that she deserved every bit of this. For the first 2 years of the marriage, life was ordinary in the best way. Michael worked in sales for a regional logistics company, climbing steadily through commission targets, while Grace worked long shifts as a nurse, and on weekends they drove out to the coast just to sit in the car and talk about the family they planned to build. They picked out names they both liked, argued gently about whether their future children would grow up playing soccer or baseball, and Michael once bought a tiny pair of shoes on a whim from a thrift store, just to have something in the house that represented the life they were heading toward. It was a small, private joke between them for a while, until it quietly stopped being a joke and started being something neither of them mentioned out loud anymore. But by year 3, Deborah's questions at every holiday dinner started to shift from curious to pointed. "So when are you two finally going to give me a grandchild? Don't wait too long, Grace. Your clock is ticking, his is." Small comments at first, easy to brush off, easy to laugh away in the car on the ride home until they weren't small anymore. Deborah's sister, Aunt Pauline, joined in eventually too, usually right after the second glass of wine at Thanksgiving, asking Grace in front of the whole table whether she'd seen someone about it yet, as though infertility were a stain that simply needed the right specialist to scrub it out. By year 4, they weren't questions at all. They were accusations dressed up as concern, repeated so often that Grace began to internalize them as fact, long before anyone in that family had any real answers, and long before she understood that the person with the actual answer was sitting right beside her at every single one of those dinners. There was one incident in particular, at a cousin's baby shower that same year, that Grace still remembers clearly. Deborah stood up during the gift-opening portion of the afternoon and, in front of nearly 40 women, said she hoped she'd live long enough to throw a shower like this one for her own grandchild someday, looking directly at Grace as she said it. Grace excused herself to the restroom and stayed there for almost 20 minutes, running the tap so no one would hear her crying, while out in the living room Michael sat with a paper plate of cake on his knee, saying nothing, letting the moment pass the way he let all of them pass. When Grace came back out, red-eyed but composed, nobody asked if she was all right. They simply assumed they already knew why. What none of them knew, not Deborah, not Grace's brother Tobias, not even Grace herself, was that 18 months into the marriage, Michael had gone alone to a fertility clinic after a difficult night talking with a college friend named Danny, who had just received his own diagnosis, and in a moment of raw honesty over beers, admitted how much it had shaken his sense of himself as a man. Something in that conversation unsettled Michael enough that he booked an appointment the following week, told Grace he had a work conference out of town, and drove himself to a clinic 2 counties over instead. He sat through the consultation alone, received the results alone, and drove home that same afternoon with a diagnosis in his glove box that he would carry, unspoken, for the next 6 years of his marriage. Michael never told Grace he went. He never told a single person in that family the truth of what he learned that day. Instead, over the following years, he simply let the story write itself. He didn't correct his mother when she blamed Grace at Thanksgiving. He didn't correct his aunt when she said it again at Easter. He sat through every one of those dinners with his jaw tight and his eyes on his plate, telling himself each time that he would explain everything eventually, that there would be a better moment, a calmer room, a private conversation instead of a public one. That better moment never came, mostly because Michael never actually looked for it. He watched his wife absorb blood draws, ultrasounds, a laparoscopy, and hormone injections that left her crying in hospital parking lots, blaming a body that had never actually been the problem at all, while he sat at home telling himself he was protecting her from something, when really he was only protecting himself. 6 years passed this way. 6 years of tests that came back with no explanation on Grace's side, because there was nothing on her side to explain. 6 years of holiday dinners where Grace quietly excused herself to the bathroom to cry into a hand towel before fixing her makeup and walking back out to face the table again. 6 years of specialists, second opinions, a fertility coach Grace found through a coworker, acupuncture appointments she scheduled on her lunch breaks, and an entire shelf in their bathroom cabinet dedicated to supplements she'd read about in forums late at night while Michael slept beside her, aware of exactly why none of it would ever work, and saying nothing. One specialist, a reproductive endocrinologist named Dr. Whitfield, spent nearly a year running Grace through every test her practice offered twice, because the results kept coming back so thoroughly unremarkable that she began to wonder if she was missing something. At one appointment, Dr. Whitfield gently suggested that a semen analysis for Michael might help complete the picture, since it was standard practice to test both partners early on. Grace remembers bringing it up to Michael in the car afterward, watching him stare straight ahead at the road, and tell her he'd already been tested years ago at a physical and everything came back fine. A lie so calm and so specific that she never once thought to question it again. She apologized to him that night for even bringing it up, for making him feel like a suspect in his own home, not knowing that the apology should have gone the other way entirely. 6 years of Michael sitting at that same table, saying nothing, letting his silence do the talking his own diagnosis should have done years earlier, because somewhere along the way silence had become easier for him than the truth. He told himself more than once that telling Grace now, 3 years in, 4 years in, 5 years in, would only make it worse, would only make the years of blame she'd already carried feel even more unbearable in hindsight. It was a convenient kind of logic, one that let him avoid the conversation indefinitely, and one that, notably, never once considered what those same years were costing her. And then came the Sunday that Deborah called what she referred to as a family meeting, a phrase that in the Reyes family usually meant money, property, or inheritance, and never meant anything good. Grace remembers Michael seeming unusually quiet in the car on the way over, tapping his thumb against the steering wheel at every red light, though at the time she assumed it was simply about his mother's health, since Deborah had been dropping hints about her will for months. 31 relatives packed into her living room that afternoon, aunts, cousins, in-laws, second cousins who only showed up for weddings and funerals, and Grace's brother Tobias, who had driven 2 hours after work just to be there, with no idea what was actually about to happen inside that house. Deborah stood up first, smoothing her skirt the way she always did before saying something important. She announced she was updating her will, and that the family property, a modest 4-bedroom home worth roughly $340,000, the same house Michael had grown up in, would go to whichever of her grandchildren carried the family name forward. There was a pause in the room, because everyone understood exactly what that sentence meant, and exactly who it was aimed at, since there were no grandchildren yet, not from Michael, not from anyone else in that generation of the family. A cousin named Renata broke the silence with a nervous half-joke about Michael needing to hurry up, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room, the kind of laughter people use when they're not sure whether it's actually funny. And that was the moment Michael Reyes, after 6 years of silence, finally chose to speak. He stood up. He looked directly at his wife, and in a voice loud enough that a neighbor 2 houses down would later tell a family member she heard clearly through an open window, he said, "It's not like it's my fault. My wife can't have kids. She's barren. Everyone in this room already knows it. I'm just the only one willing to say it out loud." The room went completely silent. Even Aunt Pauline, who had made the same insinuation a dozen times over the years, looked down at her hands like she suddenly wanted no part of what she had helped build. Later she would tell her brother that the strangest part of that moment wasn't the humiliation. It was how calm she suddenly felt, because 4 days earlier, a letter had arrived at their home addressed to Michael, a letter she had opened by mistake, believing it was hers. She had read that letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in her purse, the same purse now sitting on her lap in that exact room, while her husband told 31 people that 6 years of empty nurseries and failed appointments were entirely her failure. In the days between finding that letter and this dinner, Grace had gone through every emotion a person can move through in 96 hours, disbelief, rage, a strange numb calm, and finally something closer to clarity than she had felt in years. She stood up slowly. "Since we're having a family meeting," she said, her voice steady and quiet in a way that somehow cut through the room harder than shouting ever could have, I think there's something else this family should hear." She reached into her purse and pulled out the folded letter, and 31 relatives who had just watched her be humiliated now watched her open an envelope that was about to humiliate someone else entirely. "This came to our house 4 days ago," she said. "It's from a fertility clinic. It's addressed to Michael. I opened it by accident, and I've read it maybe 30 times since." She began reading it out loud, slowly, deliberately, letting every word land on its own, and the letter confirmed a private consultation Michael had scheduled nearly 5 years earlier, along with a diagnosis of severe male factor infertility, the kind doctors describe as essentially conclusive. In plain language, the letter stated that natural conception had been, for years, extremely unlikely, through absolutely no fault of Grace's body at all. Deborah went pale, one hand rising slowly to cover her mouth. Tobias stood up so fast his chair scraped across the hardwood floor, his fists clenched at his sides. And Michael, the man who 90 seconds earlier had used the word Barren like a gavel, said nothing at all, standing frozen in the middle of a room that had just turned on him in real time. Grace folded the letter back up without raising her voice a single time. "For 6 years," she said, "I let every single person in this family make me feel broken. I went through procedures that left bruises up and down my arms for weeks. I cried in parking lots more times than I can count because I genuinely believed it was me. He knew this entire time that it was." She looked around the room slowly, at Deborah, at Aunt Pauline, at cousins who had made jokes at her expense for years without ever once questioning why Michael sat there and let them. Then she picked up her purse and walked out the front door alone, in the middle of a room full of his family, and not a single person in that living room tried to stop her. What happened inside that house after she left, according to 3 relatives who were there, was something close to chaos. Deborah reportedly turned on her own son almost immediately, not in Grace's defense exactly, family members say, but because his silence had just put her inheritance plan, and her family's reputation, in serious question in front of relatives who would talk about this for years. Aunt Pauline apparently left within minutes, unable to look at Michael, while Tobias reportedly had to be physically pulled back by 2 cousins before he said something he couldn't take back. Michael stood in the middle of his own mother's living room, surrounded by family who had, 5 minutes earlier, been quietly laughing at his wife, now looking at him like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. Renata, the cousin who had made the offhand joke earlier that night, later told a relative that the room felt colder in those next few minutes than she'd ever experienced at a family gathering, that people who normally couldn't stop talking over each other simply sat there, staring at their plates, unwilling to be the first to say something. Michael reportedly tried to explain himself twice, starting sentences that trailed off before finishing, until Deborah finally told him, in front of everyone, that he needed to leave. Not for the night. She meant it, at least in that moment, as something closer to permanent, though within a few weeks her tone toward him would soften into something more complicated, caught as she was between her son and the truth she could no longer pretend not to see. In the weeks that followed, the story didn't stay contained inside that living room the way these things sometimes do. Grace's brother Tobias, still furious on his sister's behalf, quietly started asking questions, not out of a desire for revenge, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how long this deception had actually gone on, and who else had known. What he uncovered reframed the entire 6 years of his sister's marriage. Michael's college friend Danny eventually admitted, somewhat reluctantly, over a phone call Tobias made under the pretense of catching up, that Michael had confided in him once, years earlier, about test results he never wanted discussed again, and had specifically asked Danny never to mention it to Grace or anyone in the family. Even Deborah, once she and Tobias spoke privately weeks later, admitted something even more damning. She said Michael had once told her, in vague terms, not to get her hopes up about grandchildren roughly 3 years earlier, a comment she had dismissed at the time as simple pessimism rather than the confession it actually was. Tobias also learned, through a conversation with a cousin who worked at a different branch of the same medical network, that a nurse who had briefly overlapped with Michael's file years earlier had once mentioned to a coworker, in passing, that it was unusual to see a man his age with results that clear-cut. Small pieces, scattered across different people, that had never once been connected until Tobias started asking the right questions to the right people. Tobias also went back through years of old family photos and group texts, the kind nobody looks at twice until they're looking for something specific, and noticed a pattern he'd never registered before. Michael was rarely, if ever, the one who brought up the subject of children at family gatherings. It was always Deborah, always Aunt Pauline, always someone else, while Michael sat quietly and let it happen, occasionally adding a single line that redirected blame without ever technically lying outright. Tobias printed out 3 of those old messages and set them beside the fertility clinic letter on his kitchen table one night, staring at 6 years of his sister's life laid out across 2 pieces of paper, and understood, maybe for the first time, just how deliberately all of it had been managed. Grace, for her part, didn't go looking for revenge, and she never posted a single word about any of it online. She moved in with her brother for 2 weeks, sleeping on his pull-out couch and staring at his ceiling most nights, before finding a small 1-bedroom apartment near the hospital where she worked. She filed for divorce 11 days after that family meeting, sitting in a lawyer's office with the same folded letter now photocopied and placed neatly inside a manila folder. Michael, meanwhile, tried to control the story, sending a group text to the family insisting the letter was old news, that he had simply been waiting for the right time to bring it up, and that Grace had made an unnecessary scene out of something private. Nobody in that family group chat responded to a single word of it, and in a family that had spent years talking over each other at every holiday dinner, that silence said more than any argument ever could have. During the divorce proceedings, Michael's attorney requested updated medical documentation, reportedly hoping it would help negotiate a more favorable settlement before mediation began, believing a fresh report might soften the original diagnosis or at least muddy the timeline. That decision backfired in a way nobody in that office expected. The updated report not only confirmed the original diagnosis, it revealed that Michael had quietly pursued additional treatment at a different clinic 2 years earlier, under a slightly altered spelling of his own name, specifically so no record would ever connect back to the file his wife had already seen with her own eyes. In mediation, it wasn't the original diagnosis that damaged Michael's position the most. It was this second, deliberate attempt to hide it, a pattern of concealment stretched across 6 years and 2 separate clinics, presented across the table in a folder Grace's lawyer had prepared with a level of quiet precision that Grace herself later described as satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. The mediation itself, according to someone familiar with the proceedings, lasted most of a full day, with Michael's attorney attempting several times to steer the conversation back toward a faster, more private resolution, clearly hoping to keep the details from becoming a matter of public record. Grace's attorney, by contrast, methodically walked through the timeline year by year, letter by letter, appointment by appointment, until even the mediator in the room reportedly went quiet for a long moment before calling a recess. Grace sat through most of it without saying much at all, letting 6 years of documentation speak in a way she had never been allowed to at any of those family dinners. Grace was ultimately awarded a settlement noticeably more favorable than either side had initially expected, not because any court punishes infertility itself, which it does not and should not, but because the pattern of concealment and public humiliation weighed heavily in the final terms of the agreement. Deborah quietly rewrote her will one more time in the months that followed, and family members say the property is now designated for whichever grandchild is eventually raised in a household built on honesty. Language everyone in that family understood was aimed directly at her own son. Deborah reportedly reached out to Grace privately, months after the divorce was finalized. In a short, awkward phone call that Grace described to her brother as neither an apology nor quite not one, but something closer to a mother finally admitting she had chosen the wrong side for 6 straight years. Grace still works at the same hospital today. She started therapy roughly 6 months after the divorce, not to grieve the marriage itself, but to slowly unlearn 6 years of believing her own body had failed in a story where it was never actually part of the plot at all. Her therapist, she has said, spent the first several sessions simply helping her separate the years of medical procedures from the years of blame, since in her mind the two had become the same thing for so long that she'd forgotten they were ever separate at all. She has since become close with a small group of women from a fertility support forum she once used anonymously, women who, unlike her old family dinners, actually listen when she talks. She kept the apartment near the hospital, filled it slowly with furniture she chose entirely on her own, and repainted the second bedroom a pale yellow, not because she has any immediate plans for it, she says, but because she wanted a room in her own home that wasn't haunted by 6 years of waiting for something that was never going to happen the way she'd been told it might. Tobias visits most Sundays now, and the two of them have started a small tradition of cooking their mother's old recipes together, filling the apartment with the kind of noise and laughter that Grace says her old dinner table never had, even on its best nights. Michael moved 2 hours away not long after the divorce was finalized, taking a job with a different company in a city where fewer people knew his name. Family members say he now attends holidays alone, when he attends them at all, and that the word Barren has never once been spoken in that family again, not because anyone forgave him for saying it that night, but because everyone in that room learned in real time exactly what that single word had been quietly covering up for 6 long years. Word travels slowly in families like theirs, but it travels completely, and by the following Thanksgiving, even relatives who hadn't been in that living room knew the whole story well enough to repeat it themselves. According to one cousin who briefly kept in touch with him, Michael has since started dadding again, though he reportedly finds himself, without meaning to, bringing up the fertility diagnosis far earlier in those new relationships than he ever did with Grace, sometimes within the first few weeks. Whether that comes from genuine growth or simply the fear of ever being caught in that kind of silence again, nobody in the family seems able to agree on, and Michael himself, when asked directly by a relative at a mutual friend's gathering last year, reportedly changed the subject before answering. There's a version of this story where Grace stays silent, where she simply absorbs one more humiliation, the way she had absorbed 6 years of blame that was never hers to carry in the first place. Most people, in her exact position, worn down by 6 years of appointments, comments, and quiet grief, probably would have. It would have been the easier thing in that moment to let the room believe what it already believed, to cry quietly and let Michael's version of events become the permanent one. She didn't, and that's really the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. How many families right now are carrying some version of this exact same silence, one person's private truth quietly rewritten as someone else's public failure, simply because the real truth was inconvenient for the one person who actually had the power to say it out loud? How many people are sitting at dinner tables tonight absorbing blame that was never theirs to carry, because speaking up felt harder than staying quiet? What makes Grace's story stay with people when they hear it secondhand isn't really the letter or even the diagnosis itself. It's the 6 years that came before it, the quiet accumulation of small moments where one person could have said something and chose not to, over and over, until silence became its own kind of decision, repeated so many times it started to look like character. Michael was never asked, in any single one of those 6 years, to say something dramatic or difficult in front of a crowd. He was only ever asked, in the quiet of his own car, his own kitchen, his own bed at night, to tell the truth to one person. He had 6 years and hundreds of private opportunities to do it gently, and he used none of them, until the truth came out anyway in the worst possible way, in front of everyone he knew. Would you have opened that letter in the middle of a crowded room the way Grace did, in front of everyone in that exact moment? Or would you have waited, taken him aside quietly, and given him one more chance to tell the truth on his own, away from an audience? Let us know exactly what you would have done in the comments below, because I genuinely want to hear it, and because I suspect the answer says more about each of us than we'd like to admit. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while researching it, you're going to want to be here for the next one, about a father who discovered, standing at his own daughter's wedding, exactly why the groom's entire family had gone quiet the moment he walked through the door. Subscribe now so you never miss it, and I'll see you in the next story.